I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria automation. In this video, we're going to be learning how to use the VRA REST API to look up your organization ID. And the reason why that matters, the reason why I'm going to show you these two REST requests is in subsequent videos, such as the very next one, we're going to need that organization ID to do things like look up your organization roles and your service roles. So before we can look up roles, we have to learn how to look up your organization ID. Now we're just about to go take a look at this first request here called Get Organization ID. But before we do, let's pop on over to Aria Automation itself. Let's get logged in. I'm going to log in as an account called eng-ca-admin. I've got lots of other accounts, but this one will work for our purposes right now. I'll click sign in. And as you can see up here in the top right-hand corner, in addition to seeing the user name, I can also see my organization ID. I'm using the on-prem version of Aria Automation, and therefore my organization ID is set to the name of my VMware Identity Manager server. On the other hand, if you're using Aria Automation Cloud, we set a unique organization ID for you. But this is the organization ID. Let's dig down a little deeper and see even more about what's going on here. So when I click on the user here, this here tells me the long form version of the organization ID for this particular Aria Automation deployment. Now, you can, if you want to, write this down, but let's shortcut it here, and we'll just memorize 2 Charlie Charlie 6 is the tail end of my organization ID. So that is the long name. If you'd like to see more information, you can actually click on View Organization. And as you can see here, down on the bottom, we can see the long version of the organization ID. This is the piece of information that we need later on when we're working with the Aria Automation REST API. But since we happen to be here, I'll also show you that the short version of the ID is here, and the display name, the name that actually shows up here, is actually displayed here. And if you want to, that one piece of information can be changed. You can't change the short ID, you cannot change the long ID. You can change the display name, but that doesn't really matter for our purposes right now. Yes, I've shown you display name. Yes, I've shown you organization ID, but the one piece of info I'm really here to show you is the long organization ID, which again, mine ends in 2 Charlie Charlie 6. All right, so with that little background, let's take a look at the definition of this first REST request. So this REST request called Get Organization ID has our base URL, and then the endpoint URL is csp/gateway/am/api/logged-in/user/orgs, and our query string here is just specifying which version of the VRA API we want to use. But the key portion of this URL that's making this all work is this part here, CSP gateway am blah blah blah. You are perhaps asking yourself, how do I know that that is the endpoint URL? Well, in general, I would go to https://developer.vmware.com/apis, and I would look at the various VRA APIs to find that endpoint. But in this particular case, that's not how I found this endpoint. The way I found this endpoint was I was reading through the programming guide for the VRA API. Now, this was a while ago, and as you can see, I was looking at the VRA 8.6 version of this document. There are several newer versions of this programming guide. In the YouTube description down below, I'm going to put the URL for the latest, greatest version of this document. I happen to have been looking at the VRA 8.6 version of this document. And when I did so, down on page 11, I was in this section here titled Verify User Roles because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to look up my user roles and my service roles, which we'll talk about in the next video. But I wanted to go look up the roles, and as I went through this document, I learned several things. One, looking at this here, you can see that they're not using Postman for our examples here. Instead, they're using curl. But we can use the information that we see here for curl and translate it into what we need to know if we're using Postman. So this first section here in step number 1 says, hey, let's set up some shell environment variables recording our base URL and our credentials so that all of our subsequent curl requests can have that information. So we've got this same type of information stored in our Postman variables. The next thing I saw, and this is what brings us to this video, is that before you can look up any of your roles, before you look up your org roles or your service roles, you need to first know what your long organization ID is. And right about here is where I saw the endpoint URL that I just showed you. So this is how I happened to come across this information. We're going to take a look at that request in just a moment, but as a quick reminder, if you see documentation such as this version of this documentation, and it talks about authenticating by passing in a header called CSP-auth-token, that's the Cloud Services Authentication Token. If you're looking at older documentation and it says use CSP-auth-token, you're looking at some older documentation, which would be fine if you're running an older version of vRealize Automation, or on the other hand, if you're running a newer version of vRealize Automation or Aria Automation, this is not the correct way to authenticate anymore. This will work for some endpoint URLs, but it doesn't work for all of them. So if you see documentation like this, or if you're still using this old style, make certain you change this to -H authentication. Actually, that's not correct in the world of Postman. It's -H authorization, and then the value of that will be bearer : followed by the, bearer space followed by the access token that we already know how to create. All right, so the point of coming here is that's the URL that we're going to need to use, and we need to use that URL to get the organization ID before we can get any org IDs or service IDs. So we'll talk about those in the next video, but for right now, let's actually go ahead and run this request and see what we get back. So as you can see, when we run the request, we get back a nice, simple response body. First, we're going to check the status code. So we got a 200. That's good. In the response body, it's fairly straightforward. This JSON formatted information here has our long organization ID. You can spot it right about here. But you'll notice that there's more here than just the organization ID. There's also this URL, plus there's all of this surrounding body. We don't want all of this. We just want the long ID, which we see right here. So what I've done in the test tab, remember the test tab contains JavaScript code that gets run after the request runs. In this test code, I am using the following JavaScript code to, well, first of all, create a variable called data. And what we're going to put in that data variable is the entire response body, not as raw text, but we're going to parse this up into its various JSON components so that if we want to, we could say things like, I just want to see the ref links information, or I just want to see items. Then in lines 3 and 4, we're creating another variable called URL. And as you can see from the code here, it's going into that data variable so that we can get into the response body. And it's looking for this section on ref links, and it's grabbing just this value right here. So there's our URL. By the way, if you want to double check everything that we've got going on here, if you go to the console, you can see that my URL is in fact /csp/gateway/am blah, 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 blah. But that's still not what we want. I don't want the entire URL. I want to save away just this organization ID. So in steps 6 and 7, we're using the split method to take that URL and break it up into its different components, splitting it up on the slash. So you'll notice in line 7, we end up with this parts variable where here is one of the parts of that URL, here's the next part, here's the next part, and so forth. And at the tail end, as you can see, we've got the organization ID. Now, I'm going to trust that you're familiar with the notion of a stack and popping things off the stack. If you don't know what that is, go online and search for stack tutorial. But notice that my next chunk of code takes the parts variable and it pops off one of the parts. When we do a pop, it's going to pop off the last thing that got pushed onto parts, which is the ID itself. So again, if you don't know what a stack is, line number 9 is perhaps a little bit confusing, but in short, line number 9 is setting up a JavaScript variable here called organization ID, and that organization ID contains the long organization ID that we want. At this point, that variable is accessible within this code, but it's not accessible within Postman in general. So our final chunk of code, if we scroll down here on line number 12, is saying take the organization ID JavaScript variable that we just created in line number 9 and put it into the Postman variable called organization_ID. So this is the Postman variable, and in fact, if we go look at our Postman variables, you'll notice that organization ID, which was previously blank, now has our organization ID in the long form. And notice this one ends in 2 Charlie Charlie 6, which is the tail end of my organization ID. So we got it. We got exactly what we're looking for. Now there's one other REST request that I created here that I'd like to show you. This one's pretty straightforward. You can look at the URL and see it's essentially the same URL, but this time we're passing in the organization ID. If you pass in the organization ID, which we got from the previous request, then this new request is going to, why don't we run it and find out what it's going to do? The new request is going to get, amongst other things, the name of your organization ID. Again, both the internal name and the display name, which we see here, along with other information. Now, in this particular REST request, I didn't bother to write any code to be performed after the request is run, so my tests tab is blank. But feel free to take what you've learned in the sample code for get organization ID. You should be able to write code that looks like this, that gets any of these pieces of information that you would like to extract and save away. So again, if you want to save the organization name as a separate Postman variable, you should be able to modify this code to do exactly that. So there you have it. You now know how to use the Aria Automation REST API to look up your organization ID and your organization name. Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.